Bringing you the stories behind the standards. This is the BSI Education Podcast with Matthew Childs and Alan Sellers. Today's episode is on the consumer voice in standards.
Hello, my name is Matthew Childs and I am with Alan Sellers. Hello Alan, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. And how are you, Matthew?
I'm very well, thank you. I suppose the first thing to say, Alan, is you're back.
Yeah, I am. It's good to be back. I hope you're pleased to have me. I've been on a short break.
A holiday with 4 children? I'm not sure that could be any sort of holiday.
Well, you should come along next time.
And the second thing to say is, I suppose, welcome to the all-new BSI Education Podcast. After only 10 episodes, we've made some changes and we hope you like them. Now, the aim of this podcast is to bring you the stories behind the standards. In this episode, we are talking about the consumer voice in standards. Back in episode 6 of the podcast, we spoke with David Bell, BSI Director of Standards Policy, and Stephanie Einan, BSI Standards Makers Development and Engagement Manager, about how and why BSI engages with a wide range of stakeholders to develop standards. Now, during that episode, which you can still find on the podcast feed, David mentioned the role of consumer representation in standards making. We said then that we should return to this issue and dig a little bit deeper, and here we are. Now, Alan, you're an engineer with Dyson. You're also a standards maker. So obviously you'd be making the case for industry and manufacturers when it comes to standards. But the consumer voice, it's important too, right?
Yeah, it is, Matthew. I mean, consumers don't typically know about standards. They can be a bit invisible to them. And it's a really important voice to add into the development process of standards, because ultimately consumers are the users of products and services. And sometimes, more often than not, they will use them in ways that we didn't expect. So standards need to work for everybody. And that's why it's so important to have this voice as part of the process.
Now, our guest today couldn't be better qualified to talk about this issue. Julie Hunter is an independent consultant, writer and researcher, specialising in consumer issues. In this role, she has delivered successful projects for consumer organisations such as Which and Consumers International on topics including e-commerce fraud, insurance, inclusive service, complaints and redress. And since the 1st of August this year, she has chaired BSI's Consumer and Public Interest Network, or CPIN. Joining Julie is Liz Barclay. Liz is one of the country's leading experts on consumer finance. She is a Financial Inclusion Commissioner, Chair of the Fair by Design Anti-Poverty Campaign, a non-executive on the Lending Standards Board, and advisor to several charities and small businesses, combining these roles with journalism, broadcasting and coaching. For 10 years, she hosted BBC Radio 4's flagship consumer programme, You and Yours, and she's also chair of the BSI Consumer Forum.
We had a fascinating conversation with Liz and Julie. We started off with blue videos, talked about button batteries, and then we went to Brexit and beyond.
Now, before we hear from Julie and Liz, a reminder that for more information on BSI Education, go to bsigroup.com/education. This link and others on the themes raised in this episode can be found in the episode notes. Do please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts, and share us on social media using the hashtag BSIEdPod. And if you have any comments or questions about this episode or ideas for future episodes, then do please get in touch at education@bsigroup.com. We really welcome your feedback. We are delighted to be joined by Julie Hunter. Hello, Julie. How are you?
Hello, Matthew. I'm fine, thank you.
And we're also delighted to be joined by Liz Barclay. Hello, Liz. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Matthew.
It's fantastic to have you both on the podcast today.
It's great to be on it. We don't often get invited out, you know. Sometimes we feel as if we're being overlooked.
Oh, well, we'll put that right today. We're always really interested, Liz and Julie, in how you get to where you are today, and particularly with the standards angle.
You mean how did I become obsessed with standards? I think is the question you're really asking.
It is, yes.
I started my career in citizens advice, and we worked very closely with the local trading standards department. So standards were something that I was very conscious of right from the beginning. You know, the Trading Standards Department would help the citizens advise clients to sort out consumer disasters, to right wrongs, to ensure rules were met. We'd go on visits to markets to find counterfeit goods and often dangerous goods. So, that was the starting point, I think. And of course, there are an awful lot of different standards. I'm involved in lots of those now. But if I think right back to that beginning, one story that sticks in my mind is a gentleman who came into my office with a blue movie he'd bought in a local shop in a brown paper
really?
bag. And he said it wasn't up to standard. It wasn't the standard he'd expected because it wasn't blue enough. So he wanted his money back. The request had been refused. He wanted me to watch the movie with him to get a second opinion and then help to get redress. Now, I have to admit that I didn't comply with the request and he did get a refund. I didn't watch the movie. But, we had all sorts of wonderful experiences from watching trading standard conferences, sofas being set on fire so that they could test fire safety, etc. And really thinking about how standards like that improved and even saved lives. Demonstrations about choking on batteries, etc., and how to stop that happening to not only children, but all of that really intrigued me. And that led to an interest in consumer protection, safety standards, toys, batteries, fire safety, repairs, refurbished goods, and so on. And then now my life is dominated by standards, Equity Release Council Standards Board, Lending Standards Board, Fundraising Regulator Standards Board. So there are all sorts of different, voluntary standards, regulatory standards, safety standards, food standards that I'm involved in and really am fascinated by. And it's still a journey I'm on, I think.
It sounds very varied and broad, I have to say.
Yes,
Julie, from your side, does your journey start with the blue movie?
No, it didn't. I was invited to join the Consumer Public Interest Network about 9 years ago now because they were looking for a consumer expert in services, and I'd been working at Which as a senior researcher and project leader for around 6 or 7 years on topics like customer service, complaints, healthcare, financial services, tourism. So it's quite a broad remit, but it was all services related. And to be honest, before I joined CPIN, standards weren't really on my radar at all because I was aware of the kite mark and maybe a few product standards which were used in the Which test lab, but I was working in services. And I think like many consumers, standards were a bit invisible to me. I mean, I know now that they're everywhere. They're all around us. We come into contact with standards every single day, but we just don't know it. So I think it was only when I started working at CPIN that I realised how many standards there were, and realising that they were such a valuable tool in the consumer protection toolkit. It's kind of motivated me to keep working with CPIN and to try and spread that word really to consumers and other consumer organisations to understand the role of standards and what they can do.
Matthew, I'm not too sure. I'm happy with somebody on the podcast that says standards weren't on their radar.
Well, I think the key thing is they weren't, but they very much are now.
Yeah, I think you're right, Matthew.
I mean, Julie, you mentioned there about CPIN. We'll come back to your role in CPIN there as the chair of that particular organisation. But before we do that, Liz, you mentioned there about the different types of standards. I think it's important to remember that. I mean, what we're talking about here is sort of formal consensus stakeholder model of international standards. Now, with those, obviously they undergo a rigorous process in terms of their development, and they're reviewed every 2 to 5 years. And a really important part of that process is public consultation. So I suppose my question here is, what do we really mean by consumer representation in standards? How is it different to public consultation? Why does it matter to have a proper consumer representation in standards development?
I think it matters hugely that the people who end up having their lives impacted either by the lack of standards or their lives improved because of the standards are involved in almost the co-design of those standards, if that's at all possible. And the truth is, we don't probably as yet have enough people involved. Julie will tell you much more about the network, the people who have got the technical expertise, who can sit on the standards committees and really make a difference. But from my point of view, the Consumer Forum has a Consumer Forum Council, and we have a strategic role. We're bringing all sorts of organisations together, which Age UK, Electrical Safety First, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents, Citizens Advice, all of those organisations that are working on the ground to some extent in consumer protection. And so really understand, I suppose, what's coming over the horizon. You know, around the table, we come, all those groups, all the representatives come with foresight, with insight, with research and evidence, with strategic thinking. And we're all thinking about what is happening next? What is coming that we really need to embrace and think about now? So, for instance, we've been thinking about new trade deals through post-Brexit and wondering what will that mean for consumers. And of course, we've heard quite a lot in the press about chlorinated chicken, but it's much, much broader than that. It's about what we import into this country and to what standards those products are made in the countries that they're coming from, and how the trade deals, how can we influence so that we are sure that our consumers in this country will still be protected to at least as high a level as they have been previously. So we're always thinking about what is the next thing that we should be trying to help the standards makers prepare for, and what a good standard would look like. So, we've been through COVID. We're thinking about standards on people in vulnerable circumstances because they are in different vulnerable circumstances and different people are in vulnerable circumstances. What about the standards of face masks, for instance? What about standards for working from home? All of those issues that have popped up during COVID are things that organisations round the table think about. Julie and CPIN are a very important factor of that strategic council. And so we all work together to help guide where standards might need to be built, but also what standard committees would be best served if they had a consumer representation on that committee. And then, of course, we hand over to the committees in the network, and that's Julie's domain.
Mm-hmm. Just on that, Julie, just picking up there what Liz was talking about, the really important. It's very important that the consumers are represented in this process. I'm just interested about when. When should it happen? We talked there about the committees, but when should the consumer voice be present in that development process?
Ideally, we like to be there right at the very beginning. So we work very closely with the staff at BSI to make sure we're aware of standards that are coming up. We also put forward ideas for where we think there are gaps. But we try to get in there right at the very beginning so that we can influence the scope of a standard and the content and what it's going to include or not include. And that's why it's different to the public consultation, because you mentioned that earlier. It's a very valuable check and balance, public consultation. And we definitely want to encourage as many organisations as possible to get involved at that stage. But that comes after 1 or 2 years of drafting usually. So there's no opportunity there to help develop the content from scratch. And that's what, CPIN and other consumer organisations can do if they're members of committees or working groups that are developing standards and we're involved from the very beginning. We can make sure that all of the key issues are addressed right at the start, which makes the standard much more, credible and robust. So it's really, really important that we are involved. As Liz said, we can make sure that all of the key issues are included. And coordinated consumer representation is very different to public consultation as well, because CPIN reps, for example, we train all of our reps to make sure they take the needs of all consumers into account. They think about not just the intended use of a product or service, but also unintended use, misuse, malicious use, and they try to identify all of the risks that could occur. So the consumer representation is very, very important, and it has to happen right from the beginning.
You mentioned, we've mentioned CPIN a few times already. So I'm going to ask you about CPIN's priorities. and sort of where it sits within sort of the standards making infrastructure. Before we do that, though, let's hear from Helen Gray. Now, Helen is part of the consumer team here at BSI. I spoke to Helen last week and asked her to give us a CPIN in 60 seconds.
The Consumer and Public Interest Network, or CPIN, is an independent consumer organisation. It exists to empower and protect consumers, making everyone's lives safer, fairer and better through effective consumer representation and British standards. Established in 1951, CPIN's trained volunteers participate in the development of standards to highlight key consumer issues, making sure that real-life problems are addressed and the risk of consumer harm is minimised. CPIN believe that all consumers have a right to safe and accessible goods and services, clear information, fair treatment, effective systems of redress and a healthy environment. CPIN representatives use the United Nations guidelines for consumer protection as the foundation of their work. They sit on hundreds of standards development committees, speaking up for consumers.
Now, Helen mentioned a really important point there about CPIN. She mentioned its independence. Just for you, Julie, what do we mean by, how is CPIN an independent organisation?
Because CPIN is an independent network of volunteers who speak up for consumers in standards. And what a lot of people don't realise is that we do operate independently from BSI. So I lead the CPIN steering group, which has oversight of the CPIN strategy, and we decide on our own priorities, which work we're going to undertake. We develop our own views, consumer positions, and BSI facilitates and supports our work via the consumer team. So that's Helen, who we just heard from, a team of fab people at BSI HQ, basically, who make all of our work possible. So we do operate independently, but with support from BSI. And we also have funding from BAYS to make sure that our reps have the resources they need to travel to meetings, to make sure, we fulfil the obligation to include a consumer stakeholder.
So BAYS, obviously, just to clarify, BAYS is obviously the business and industry department here in the UK.
Yeah.
In terms of priorities, and what are the current priorities for CPIN? What are you currently working on?
Okay, well, broadly, we operate. All our work is based on 5 priority areas. So we have inclusivity, sustainability, consumer safety, digital, and I'm going to... The other one will come to mind in a moment.
This is a test. So.
Yes, it is. But we have 5 priority areas, and basically if new work comes in, if it meets one of those 5 priorities, then we will undertake that work. So we also, our work is based on the guided really by the consumer principles. So they're things like making sure that consumers have access to the products and services they need, that products and services are safe. Safety, that was the 5th one. That they have the right information to make sure that they can, make informed decisions about the products and services they're using, that they can access redress. So there's lots of priorities and principles that we use as the foundation of our work, basically, to make sure that consumers are, getting what they need from products and services.
And next year, 2021, it's the 70th anniversary of CPIN. So that's a fantastic long-standing tradition here, isn't it, for consumer reps?
Yes, it is. We started life in 1951 as the Women's Advisory Committee. Obviously, we do let men in now. So we're a much broader group of people, much larger group of people now. But yes, 70 years. It's a fantastic achievement. We're still going strong.
That is great.
Liz, on your side, so we've talked about the Consumer Forum and CPIN. I just wonder how those two organisations work together. How does that work?
Well, as I've said, Julie attends the council meetings, and so CPIN is a fundamental element of the Consumer Forum Council. And then, quite apart from those strategic meetings, then Julie and I meet up as and when we need to in order to discuss things that are on the horizon. And of course, we have the Consumer Forum Conference. That's on the 18th of November as part of the BSI Standards Conference this year. This is the second one, and CPIN will be very involved in that. And we work together, I think, to try to get much more awareness, but also to spark interest in the kind of people who might be interested in joining Julie's network, and to think about the kind of organisations that might be thinking strategically who we would like to invite to come onto the council. So we do work together very closely, but always in mind, in the back of our minds, is the question, who is out there that we might work with better and more effectively in order to help make BSI's standards more effective for the people who end up using the products. So it's always about putting the consumer at the heart of it. And I think that's where we both come from. That is our motivating factor. So it's very easy to work together on that.
Just a final thought about the sort of infrastructure then. We've talked about the UK. I assume there's sort of European and international structures and systems for the consumer voice?
Yes, there is. And to be fair, Julie will know much, much more about this than I do, because I have not been involved at the international level. But we do have various structures and various committees that the UK has been fundamentally important to over the past few years, and will continue to be involved in even after the 1st of January. And so those will continue to be important. And BSI is a national standards body. So along with other national standards bodies, it is very important to keep up that connection. Julie can tell you more about ANEC and Capolco. We have a lot of acronyms in BSI. And although I've been here for about a year now, I'm still trying to get my head around some of them.
Don't worry, I'm 5 years in and I still struggle sometimes with the various acronyms and names.
I was just going to say, we also have the ISO standards, the international standards. So, it all plays in together, but Julie has got a better picture of that, I think, than I do.
Around 95% of British standards are actually international in scope. So it's really, really important that the consumer voice is heard in those. We know that a lot more issues, consumer issues, are global now. As we shop online and we travel, we are kind of getting rid of borders in terms of the way that we move and we spend, and international standards are really valuable because they can address these global consumer issues and kind of reach across borders, because obviously there's no legal framework that reaches globally. So standards can ensure that there's consistency and quality and protection. And CPIN contributes to international standards, lots and lots of them, via BSI mirror committees, which are here in the UK. So that's groups of experts that will discuss our contribution to a specific standard here, and then we will go forward and put that forward as our national position into an international standard. But we also have lots of members of CPIN who sit directly on working groups as consumer experts, and we work very closely as well with consumer organisations to share insight and to strengthen the consumer voice, because CPIN is kind of the gold standard of consumer representation internationally. We've been going, as I said, since 1951. We're quite well resourced. We've got very well trained reps, more than 60 of them now. And we can put our view forward, but we also need other countries to be putting the consumer perspective forward to strengthen that consumer voice. So we make sure that we work very closely with other consumer stakeholders working in Europe and internationally as well. We collaborate quite a lot with Consumers International, which is member organisation of around 200 consumer organisations around the world, to better understand consumer issues that are affecting, consumers in other countries, which may be different to the UK.
I think that's a really important point you both made there around the fact that by getting involved and by participating at a national level through BSI as a national standards body and other national standards bodies around the world, you're automatically influencing the international standards, because of the vast majority of standards are operating at international levels. I think that's a really, really important you've both made there. I just wondered to move us on then to looking at the impact, the difference that consumer representation is having. What difference that is making, that consumer representation is making to actual standards that are out there. Do you have any particular examples you could share with us? You mentioned earlier on, I think, issues around consumer vulnerability and button batteries. Maybe on the button batteries, Liz, anything you want to expand on for us there?
Well, I think I think one of the issues is that we probably started looking at button batteries because of toys. But it has since been recognised that button batteries are used in adult products as well. And so it's not just about protecting children when toys are bought for them, but it's also about protecting children from household items that might hold button batteries, if you see what I mean. So it's always about starting somewhere and then thinking much more broadly. Seatbelts, for instance, if we go right back to seatbelts, when they were designed with men in mind as the drivers. And it was the standard that actually got to the bottom of the fact that, well, seatbelts designed just for men don't necessarily fit comfortably for women. And so therefore we have to do a bit more thinking around about how we design seatbelts. So if you look at those two examples, and then, we talked about fire safety, but what about dishwashers, for instance? We've had a lot of incidents in the news, in the headlines this year and last year about fires started by dishwashers. So what is the standard, and how do those dishwashers that do cause fires, how do they fail to meet the standards? Have they been imported from a country that doesn't meet the standards, or has actually somebody made a mistake somewhere in the production and therefore it's a situation where they have to be recalled? More recently, face masks, for instance. A lot of face masks were made that didn't meet the standards, and so therefore a lot of money was spent on ineffective face masks. So those are all examples of where really good input from consumers at the beginning of the process, as Julie says. We want to be right in there at the beginning. So at the beginning of the process, can we influence how products are designed as well as produced to a standard that works for all of the people who will end up using it in all of the circumstances that we can possibly imagine. But then standards are living documents, and they do have to be revised and looked at and reviewed because technology changes, etc. And we're now looking at standards because our lives are so much more digital now than perhaps anybody even imagined at the beginning of 2020. So that will be another area of concern. Have we got the standards right? Do we need to rethink them? Do we need to revise them?
I found it really interesting that at the beginning we started talking about the invisibility of standards to consumers. And then I can see that through the organisations that you represent, the Consumers Forum and CPIN, that you're trying to address that invisibility to consumers. And then you're bringing that consumer voice into this process as part of the stakeholder engagement, which we've talked about before in previous podcasts. And it's fascinating to hear how that consumer voice has brought about these changes. But are there any kind of specific examples that you can refer to just to bring home to our listeners some of the specific changes that have happened? I mean, from my involvement as a standards maker and as somebody that works in household appliances, I know that we have a box of fingers in our test lab, and I think that might well be as a result of some of the work that has been happening through this consumer voice being brought to bear on the standards development process.
Well, that is a really good example, yes. Alan, and I think Julie knows a lot about that one.
Yeah,
but it will really paint a picture.
Yeah, I mean, I can give you a few examples, Alan. Well, around domestic appliances, when CPIN started work, it was a lot of the issues were around product safety and around domestic appliances. That's how we started. And there's some really good examples of how we've managed to improve products by making them safer, better quality, more accessible, and also making sure that they address real issues that affect real people. Because one thing that's really important to remember is that even businesses with the best intentions can often miss things. And consumer reps can point out things very often that businesses have missed. So I'll take you through like a little journey from lawnmowers to domestic appliances and test fingers to connected toys. So I'll take you through that briefly because that's kind of a good chronological journey as to what we've done.
I'm going to enjoy how you connect these dots, I have to say.
Well, so we've got lawnmower safety, okay. So when new electric lawnmowers were introduced, all of a sudden there were lots of women going to A&E with foot injuries, chopped off toes. Okay, women were using lawnmowers for the first time. They were lighter than petrol mowers, okay. But they were using a vacuuming action. So they were going forwards, backwards. I'm doing the motion, but you can imagine. Whereas traditional petrol mowers were pushed up and down in lines. So there wasn't a bar at the back to protect feet from blades. It hadn't been needed before. And it took a consumer representative to point out the problem. Hang on, these new electric lawnmowers are being used in a different way to the petrol ones. And that's why all the injuries were being seen. And they managed to get into the standard that there should be a protective bar fitted at the back. And all of a sudden, hey presto, feet were intact. So that's one really good example, I think, of how, businesses just hadn't seen what the problem was and a consumer rep had pointed it out. The other thing that you mentioned is the box of test fingers. Which does make me laugh.
I do have to clarify, it is a box of test fingers, not actual fingers.
But another example is domestic appliances. So traditionally, we've got a whole range of standards that cover different domestic appliances. So, refrigerators, washing machines, etc. And previously, the standard only allowed for the intended audience, which was, if you were between 18 and 60, for example, that you would be using those appliances. But of course, we all know that other people in the home come into contact with those appliances. Children use toasters, they use kettles. And for example, if a small child is playing in the kitchen, they're very close to the refrigerator. If their little car goes underneath the fridge, they're going to put their hand underneath there to try and get that car out. Now, previously, access to live parts was only tested with an adult-sized test finger, which meant that smaller fingers could get in, causing...
And I'm guessing that's important because those live parts could electrocute somebody.
Yeah, could cause, serious injury or even a fatality. So consumer representatives campaigned for a child-sized test finger to be included, and it's now happening across a wide range of standards. So that's a really, really important consumer success and, really important for consumer safety because we use domestic appliances. We all use them in the home or we all come into contact with them. So it might not be the intended user in the, instruction manual, but people do have access to them in the kitchen. And then finally, kind of moving on to the kind of modern day, we've got connected toys. So we've been doing a lot of work on toys that are connected to the internet. And some consumer organisations a few years ago discovered that strangers could hack into children's toys, find out their location, and even speak to children through the device. So that prompted CPIN to drive forward a new international standard on privacy by design, because I think a lot of manufacturers just weren't considering how these toys might be used maliciously. And the consumer representatives helped to point that out. And the privacy by design standard will help to make sure that these issues are addressed at the design phase. So before the toys even get to market, it'll be a checklist to get them to think about all the potential uses and to make sure that there's proper security and authentication so that strangers can't access them. So
it's the next step on, I think, Julie, isn't it, from the days when we used to stand in the lab and watch eyes being pulled out of teddy bears to see how easy it would be for a child to swallow up an eye.
Yes,
So when you think of it, the standards have progressed as technology has progressed and as products have changed.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, technology has created so many new risks and challenges for consumers And we need to make sure that we keep up with all of those things, and they're written into the standards as they're developed.
And that's one thing, again, if I can just say that we will be talking about at the Consumer Forum Conference, we're living much more digitally. So where do those risks sit now? Are there different risks that we need to be aware of and need to be addressing?
Actually, Liz, you're right to mention the conference. If you're listening to this episode after the conference, which does take place
18th of November.
18th of November next week. It will be recorded, so you will be able to watch that after the event. Obviously, the conference is online at the moment, like most conferences, so you will be able to listen to that after the event. I wanted to, with you both, is there any other examples you want to share before we move on to sort of the final challenge, the sort of future challenges? Is there anything we've missed?
No, I still keep coming back to setting the sofa on fire. When the fire safety regulations changed a long, long time ago, and I dread to think how long ago it was really interesting to see how the tests were carried out. And that has got to have saved a lot of lives. If you had a sofa that was likely to go on fire, then of course that might have gone to a second-hand shop that might have been then recycled to someone else. Fire safety regulations made it impossible for those products that weren't tested and to standard to go on sale in the first place. And it then became you would find then that second-hand shops wouldn't take those items of furniture that hadn't got the standard and that you didn't have the standards label for. So it did help to, I am absolutely convinced, save lives in house fires that otherwise, might have happened because someone wasn't paying particular attention. And so, I really think that is... the figures are out there somewhere as to how many fires have not happened as a result of those fire safety standards. But I think that just proves that standards can save lives.
I think you painted a beautiful picture, actually, of the, since 1951, how the consumer voice in standards has made a difference and has made an impact, as you say there, Liz, on consumer safety. And also some of Julie, you've talked about CPIN's current priorities that you're working on. Obviously, looking forward to another 70 years, a 70-year anniversary next year, and just keep going. We'll hit 100 and beyond. I just wonder then, as we think, we've got the current priorities, but thinking about future challenges in terms of future challenges for consumer representation standards. Julie, what's on sort of your agenda and radar as we go forward?
Okay, I mean, well, we're seeing much greater demand for consumer representation now than ever before. And I think, as I mentioned before, this is due to a lot of new technology, things like connected products, e-commerce, globalization, new ways of doing things. All of these are creating new risks for consumers that we have to address, and we can address through standards. And the important thing is that we need to be really agile. So one of my key objectives as the CPIN Chair is to strengthen CPIN and to make sure that we can be agile to respond to these new risks and challenges. And we've got flex standards now and PASs that can be developed more quickly, but also things like the privacy by design standard, for example. Instead of trying to change hundreds and hundreds of different product standards, we can have a principles-based standard like that can apply to a very, very wide range of products and standards. And that's the way forward, I think, with some of these complex issues, is creating these principled by design standards that can, work across a wide range, have a greater impact, I guess. So it's just really important for us that CPIN and our representatives have the resources that we need to meet that demand. And we're building on our membership all the time. We've always got lots of events and people coming forward to just show an interest in being a consumer rep. And we always welcome, new people who want to become a consumer champion in standards.
So where can they get involved? It sounds like you need some more people. Maybe people listening here would like to get involved.
Yeah, we're looking for people with a really broad range of skills. Everyone is can everyone is trained, and we support them through the process. You can have a look at our consumer pages on the BSI website. That's bsigroup.com/consumers, or you can drop us an email, consumer@bsigroup.com.
Thanks for that, Julie. We'll put those links up on the episode notes as well, so people can go through directly.
Great,
and thank you also for mentioning their PAS, which is a publicly available specification, so a type of British standard, and a nice segue, because we're going to be looking at one of those in the next episode. So thank you for setting that up nicely.
My pleasure.
Liz, from your side, then, in terms of you've mentioned Brexit at the very beginning, is that the future challenge, you think, for consumer representation at the moment?
Well, I think new trade deals, definitely. What are the goods that we are going to be trading, and with whom are we going to be trading them? And I think that is a big area of interest for BSI, certainly for organisations like Which, who sit on the Consumer Council, the Consumer Forum Council. So they bring those issues to the table. But I'm also interested in sustainability, in the environment, in things like connected vehicles, for instance, because of course we are seeing a big move away from petrol and diesel cars to electricity. What will that mean in terms of standards and safety? And ethics, as Julie said, if we can get the values and principles into the design of the products in the first place, then that's really useful, but very helpful to have a standard that says to product designers and manufacturers, look, consider the ethics right from the beginning, and vulnerability, because I think the world is changing so quickly. We were in the middle of a digital transformation, but I think we're about 5 years in advance of what we necessarily expected to be, given that we've all had to rush to work from home, and people have had to change their lifestyles as a result of the COVID pandemic. So people will be vulnerable to different things. There are more scams on the internet, for instance. There are more people at home who have no contact with the outside world during the day and who are struggling with their mental health. And we know that can lead to different patterns of behaviour. Have those patterns of behaviour been thought about in the design of products and services? Is there a standard? Is the vulnerability standard actually as up to date as it might be to take into consideration all of those changes? That's where my head is strategically. What is it that we need to be thinking about next, or need to be dealing with next? And that's what the Council is looking at now.
That's a very interesting point, because I guess over the last 70 years, who is thought of as being vulnerable as products and services have evolved has changed.
I'd love to add, sorry, Anna, just wanted to add to that. We are doing loads of work on vulnerability at the moment.
Yes, we are.
So I just want to get that in, because we are doing, we've had a standard in place since 2010, which was a British standard on vulnerability, which we are now updating and revising as an international standard, recognising, as I said before, that these issues cross borders. And we've had great take up in the UK by regulators. Regulators, this is a really important way that we've had an impact on consumers, because this is in areas of essential service, so energy, water, and it's all about helping organisations to identify and support people in vulnerable situations. So I just wanted to get in there that there's lots of work going on in that space, and you're completely right that the issues have changed, and it's really important that organisations know what to do, what good practice is.
But it's not just the issues that have changed, it's the what. To what are people vulnerable now? And so there's a lot of work a lot of thinking being done around that. And that is another of the issues that we'll be addressing at the Consumer Forum Conference.
Yeah, I guess it'd be interesting to think about who is vulnerable in terms of environmental standards that are coming in, or repairability, or any number of different technological or
yes,
changes.
or to scams, as I've mentioned, because of course, if you're at home and isolated, you are more likely to connect with somebody who connects with you, and not necessarily realise that you're being scammed.
And I can imagine that the consumer voice in that is so important, because, like you say, it would be less of a perspective that, say, regulators or manufacturers or anybody else involved in that stakeholder process of developing standards would be at home with.
I mean, that's a key area that we're covering in the Consumer Vulnerability Standard, is the importance of consulting with consumers or groups that represent consumers to make sure that organisations have an understanding of the lived experience. People who've actually lived through that experience of being vulnerable. What do they want? What do they need? And what can businesses do to make their lives, easier? How can they help them to access services, understand options available, make informed decisions? And there's a big emphasis now on situational vulnerability. So it's not just, it's a moving thing. You can be vulnerable for, a week or a month and then maybe not. You could be suddenly made vulnerable due to losing your job, having a change in income. As Liz said, being isolated, maybe rural isolation. So there's lots of different
and bereavement, which of
Yeah.
course is a big issue at the moment.
Mm.
But
Yeah,
as
so
I said right at the beginning, I think it's the importance of almost that co-design of products and services that helps the manufacturer and the designer to realise from the beginning what that lived experience can bring to the process.
It's certainly been my experience as a standards maker and with the committees that I'm a part of that the discussion gets not heated, but it becomes much better when we have a diverse range of thoughts around the table. So I think it's very important.
Yeah, and that's the important thing about having, the consumer stakeholder, because in standards development, all relevant stakeholders have to be included. And so that could include industry or, academia, but it also includes consumers. And it is really, really important, because otherwise you've got a picture with a big missing part. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. You need all of those different pieces to come together to make sure that you're addressing all of the issues. And if you have one of those stakeholders missing, then, there could be big gaps in what the standard's offering.
But that also leads us on to the question about diversity, because, of course, we need diversity of thinking around all of those tables, which is why the Council tries to draw in as many different organisations with as much expertise across all the various sectors and issues as we possibly can, because you don't want a dozen people all thinking the same, saying the same things around a table. It doesn't get you anywhere. You need the dozen people to be coming at it from different angles. So diversity is extremely important for us, and diversity of thinking.
I think that sounds like another podcast, doesn't it, Matthew?
It does. In fact, yeah, I was about to say, we have got something lined up on that diversity of perspectives. I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's a really nice point on which to finish, really. I just want to thank you both for your fantastic insights and your passion for this area. So thank you very much. Thank you, Julie.
Great. Thanks for inviting us on.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
You have been listening to an episode of the BSI Education Podcast. To find out more, visit bsigroup.com/education.
You just heard a Stripped Media production.